All right, well, this is our third take. All right. Thank you so much, AM, for joining me today on my podcast. That doesn't have a name quite yet, but we're going to go forward with this. Yeah. So do you want to just get started with a quick introduction about yourself, where you're from,
Sure.
and how did you end up being at UW as a graduate student and stuff?
Yeah. Well, I am from a very small, unincorporated town of 183 people in rural Southern Virginia.
Uh-huh.
And then... I grew up and kind of got out of that area, went to college on the East Coast at a small liberal arts, and then at that point I was like, how far can I get away from here? And without exactly leaving the U.S., I was tempted, but I was like, I don't exactly want to go to Alaska. Mm-hmm. I don't think Alaska would me and Alaska would not fare well. I would adapt, but if I had to, but but Washington was pretty great. So I shot off a few applications, and UW Seattle was one, and it came back.
Already, great. Okay, all right, great. So just as you mentioned, right, you're from Virginia originally, from a small town, and then you went to a liberal arts college on the East Coast, and then you're going to be like, I don't want to have anything to do with the East Coast anymore.
I wanted to get away.
Get away as far as possible. And I feel that sometimes. I'm like, can I just go to Arctic or somewhere for a month and just for a whole year and just like live my life there, escape from everything, deal with everything there. Definitely great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so you're currently a graduate student here at UW doing French?
No, so I mean, yes, it's more than that, but so my undergrad was in French and Spanish, so I studied both, and then what kind of brought me to UW was doing comparative literature, which brings them together. Enables someone to pair. So I'm in comparative lit, but it no longer exists here.
Oh, okay. So is it more of like CHID now? Is it kind of like
I work in CHID a lot because there's so much crossover between what comparative literature used to do and what the comparative history of ideas does. So we both work in a comparative mode, and we think about comparative analyses a lot. Yeah.
So kind of going off that a little bit, right? For our listener who don't really know what shit is, or like what the comparative literature is, do you mind going a little bit deeper? Like, what does it really mean to do like comparative history of ideas, or like literature and stuff like that?
Totally. Yeah. So comparative literature, I mean, we could talk about how it like historically manifested in the U.S., and that would be a little bit maybe too niche, but in general, it was kind of like studying other major imperial powers' literature. So we would study French literature or Spanish literature, right? Because they're the other two major imperial powers. And so it was a kind of way to understand them and understand their cultures. So, comparative literature changed over time. But in the U.S., what you're tasked with is knowing two major languages, and a lot of times they're the dominant ones, right? Of course, part of that legacy.
Yep.
And so, you're just comparing and kind of looking at two or more cultures, right? And with the comparative history of ideas, you're kind of doing that same thing, but you're kind of like shifting the lens a little bit to something else. You're not so much looking at the cultures exactly, but that will come into the conversation.
Okay.
But you're looking at how ideas have transformed over time, or how they have circulated across different cultures, and you're comparing them at different moments on the globe, right? To be like, why is this similar here on the planet, but also perhaps here on the planet?
Yeah.
And how might they be different too? So
I see. So it's kind of like holistic in a sense, right?
It kind of is, yeah. I do think comparative literature and comparative thinking in general, I think, gives us a kind of like, sometimes I think about it like when you look through a telescope, right? You only get one viewpoint. That's kind of like traditional disciplinary analysis. Like you just hone in on one thing, and you have your like microscope, your telescope. But when you do it comparatively, it's almost like a stereoscope. You put on two lenses, and then you get it's almost like, back in when they actually made stereoscopes, like when they first started historically, right? Like it would attract people because it gave this optical illusion of reality of like the image was more real than if you only saw it through one, right? So comparative analyses generally do this type of stereoscopy, but you do it kind of in your brain, right?
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So I think going off that a little bit, right? The closest I can think, like when you were talking about like the idea of looking at through like a stereoscope and like looking at through like a holistic viewpoint, right? Yeah. This reminds me a lot of a book by Yuval Noah Harari called *Sapiens*. Okay. I don't know if you read it.
No.
Okay,
please tell me.
That reminds me a lot of it because that book's idea is basically looking at human history comparatively, like from the beginning to the end, like to where we are presently, and seeing like how everything, like from geography and from like location of like mainly geography, like location of rivers, the climate and everything, and how that affects the growth and like the population of ideas of like humans in general, right? And how one region, for example, in Europe, how Europeans became the ones that's like conquering the world instead of like, let's say, perhaps Chinese or like the Egyptians or anybody else, right? So it's kind of like that idea. That kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
So would you say like in your work, right? When you're like looking into literature and stuff, would you say there's going to be a lot of times where you're like looking at different cultures, for example, like the African culture or like 100%. The Asian culture, and be like, hey, these two are very similar things. Like, why is it that perhaps they are similar?
Yeah,
stuff
totally.
Like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I work in the Caribbean. That's my focus. Yeah. And so, I mean, the Caribbean, you've got, I mean, it's a completely multicultural oriented society and has been for a very long time because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of the kind of importation of certain Asian forms of labor that came in the wake of abolition and so forth. So, you know, these cultures are completely, you know, I just was recently teaching, I think, Chaitan, who's the one that you know. He was taking a course with me where we were reading literature from the Caribbean where they're talking about these developments and predominantly creolization, the blending together of different groups of people. And so in that course, we were talking about, it's a kind of, it relates a lot to the comparative type stuff because you got to always be like, well, there's this component in it and this component in it and this component in it and this component in it. And we got to think about all of them all in this much more holistic type way. And, you know, doing certain types of Creole thinking, I think, really helps us get unstuck in the U.S. a lot. But, you know, I think we've largely forgotten about the Caribbean, even though the Caribbean is kind of like the birthplace of the quote-unquote Americas when the Europeans created it, right?
Oh, really?
But we don't know that anymore. Yeah.
Because I don't know that. As a student over here, right? You know? Wow. That's fascinating. Yeah. Do you mind, like, let's dive in a little bit deeper in that sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, like, for me, right, can you just give me, like, a brief history on Caribbean? Because I personally don't really know much about it. So that would be great. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there were indigenous groups for a long time, right? Until the contact period when the Europeans came and conquered. And so that first group, that was Columbus's expedition. So 1492, boom, they start shoving the, you know, kind of like flags in the ground. They're rolling out. And this is like Spanish Inquisition era, right? So they are in religious conquest mode. So they roll in and they're reading these edicts and things declaring the land as not being used. They swipe it from indigenous peoples, right? The church accumulates all of this everything, right? So the Spanish are the kind of first wave to do that, and that really transforms the area. Indigenous people get enslaved, etc. They start working in pretty horrific conditions. And then, you know, the transatlantic slave trade comes in after that, and that's really brought in really with the French and the British and the Dutch, and there's German influence in there too. This is why the comparative is really useful, because you can, again, see all of those different components. I just focus on the French and the Spanish parts, but there's so much to Caribbean history, though, that you'd have to look at multiple different empires seizing on that area. And that's just... that history is so hard to trace. You can never present it in a coherent way because you're like, well, I could go into the Dutch part, but I can't do that as a scholar because I don't speak Dutch. That's a limit for me, right?
I see.
I do know that the presence is in the history of the Caribbean, and when you look at it today, the things that they're struggling against now, you can see all of these imperial colonial influences still happening, right? So the Caribbean has been, for the past 500 years, kind of a European playground and a U.S. playground, too, for a lot of, imperial colonial control and so forth. But it's, we're coming out now with new studies that I think are quite critical of this and can see it and can now, I don't know, it's cool to have kids read Caribbean lit and to think about it. But,
That's interesting. That is fascinating. Okay, thank you for the quick history lesson.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could go into more. There's so much, but, it's hard to condense.
Okay, I understand. So, going into that, right?
Yeah.
I'm assuming that you're fluent in French and also in Spanish?
I trained for it. Yeah.
So then, what is, can you talk to us a little bit about, the French and the Spanish viewpoint on the Caribbean issues and stuff?
Yes. I love this part because this is where I always want students to think comparatively when we think about empire. And I do think that is the advantage of comparative thinking, right? Again, thinking a little bit more holistically. I think we have a tendency in the U.S. sometimes, one, to not even clock it as an empire.
Yeah.
Two, when we do clock it as an empire, I don't think we have a comparative analysis of how other imperial formations influence it and how they function and how we have a history with them. So, for example, there's a reason why so many U.S. folks love France. We have a long, intertwined imperial history together, right?
Yep.
So, there's a love of France, etc. Paris is the other kind of global metropolitan center of the world, right?
Yep.
There's a reason for that, So, when we think about the differences, I think one of the things we were just working on in class this past round was thinking about the British system of accommodation and kind of home rule, where they would invade but allow folks to kind of rule themselves in this type of system, right? The French don't do that. The French historically have adopted a kind of assimilation, which is you are now French. And deviation from Frenchness, right? You get the protection of Frenchness, even though it's kind of a catch-22. You get the so-called protection of Frenchness, but you have to get rid of your cultural backwardsness. So that means your religion. That means your, ethnic identity, whatever that might be. And so this is why right now France is going through their own kind of, I think, deep awakening, because they too are coming to realize that, that issue is not just a U.S. issue, but it's just a different flavor of their racism and imperialism. But it does show you these kind of two faces of how imperial power can work, right? It can work through a kind of accommodation way, but it can also work through an assimilationist way. And that's fascinating, right? And that's only within the Western imperial family. I don't know much of, or I don't focus on other major imperial formations on the globe, but at least in the family of the West, those two are two of them that really are split, but are still quite similar, right? And then we can kind of group those together because they're both secular. And so the Spanish, when they came in, were quite theological oriented, right? So they conquered, and their imperialism was through theology. And I think we when we talk about imperialism in the U.S. a lot too, I don't hear a lot of people talk about the secular component and how that works. And so as a scholar looking historically, you can't help but not see that when you're like, well, we went through a process of secularization. And for, the Spanish, they began as a kind of religious reconquest over Muslim territory that had been invaded, right?
I see.
Anyway, there's tons in there,
there's a lot of depth,
I was hopefully giving you a little bit of that comparative work, just helps you better understand the multiple layers that are there.
And the difference between how they two cultures kind of treat things differently, the same territory and stuff. That's
100%,
fascinating.
Right?
Yeah. That's really cool. So was there a reason that you got into this? Like, how did you end up here? Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I keep calling it. I'm writing about it a little bit now. Because I'm trying to finish this project.
Okay.
And I just kind of keep calling it the mystery. But
the mystery. Cool.
It's, for me, I think as I was going through school, I went through my undergrad. And I love my undergrad professor. I was really, really close with them. They really, I think, helped me train in like how to do literary analysis, right? Like how to interact with a text and question the text, and usually talk with people about assumptions that we might have about the text, or how our interpretations are not always super accurate. Like they gave me, without really kind of knowing it at the time, but they were teaching me a hermeneutics, which is like
what is that?
Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation, like how to be skillful at interpretation and a little bit more critical.
Okay.
Right? Because if you're reading an 18th century French text, right, you have to be able to translate what is going on in that world to what's happening in our world, right? Because otherwise people are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? Why were these people wearing these weird things, And you're like, well, maybe it's weird to us, but it wasn't weird to them, know? So things like that happen. But I feel like I got really well trained at that. But I wasn't too aware of the imperial stuff yet. And I think when I joined them together, I was like, I want to work on the Caribbean. I was drawn to it. And then I came here and, I started taking courses where I was thinking a lot more about empire and land and labor and the role of the university in that too, right? Like, I try to get my students to think a lot about the history of the university and to have a critical history of the university, which is a history that's thinking about power, right? And like, universities don't exist outside of empires. They exist in them, right? So they have a role. And so what is the role of a university within an imperial formation? It's mainly to be, and there are scholars who write about this, that it's a kind of factory for knowledge production. You have knowledge workers, right? And so they're all producing knowledge, and it helps, especially when it becomes state-backed, right? So we can think of, there is a moment when the university was not paired to the state, right? That it became state-backed in its development, right? And so I think right now we're in a very interesting moment too, because many people keep saying that it's the death of the university, right? We're dying now, and something new is being born, and that we're in this big transitional moment. There's something to that that's very titillating to me, that I like it and I'm interested, right? And I do think it is happening. We're having big talks on our campus about what is the vision of the global research university, and what do we do after the pandemic, right? So something is going on there, but... So, I don't know. There's, as I came here and I started thinking more about the university, I started thinking much more critically about the disciplines too, which is doing that kind of, telescoping look. And I learned a lot more about my own discipline, and I learned a lot more about French and Spanish as disciplines. And I realized these were created by imperial powers to study other imperial powers, right?
Wow, that's fascinating thought,
this is why, not a lot of, we're trying to do better at it now, right? But you see the proliferation of indigenous languages are starting to come out now, that we're having much more talks around decolonization, thinking about empire a lot more, right? And that work is so necessary. Because I do think English is a colonial language. It's imbued with coloniality. It was part of the conquest to getting people to speak English, right? So we're even limited by language of how to think outside of certain things. But
wow, that is an interesting thought. Yeah,
but I think to bring this back to the Caribbean is that, universities were some of the first things to be established in the Caribbean. You can think of one of the oldest universities in the Americas is the University of, I think it's at Santo Domingo. And it's Spanish-based university, right? And it's still in operation.
Yeah.
And we can think of them really as kind of like secular, missionary-oriented ventures, right?
Interesting, yeah.
But they are spreading certain new forms of knowledge production through training people.
Yeah.
And if we know that historically, not a lot of indigenous people getting degrees during that time, right?
Yeah.
So things have changed as time has gone on now, and since kind of like the 1960s, when a lot of minoritized people have gained access to the university, we're changing a lot of the knowledge that is being produced out of here, right? So for some of us, we're like, hey, let's think about empire. Hey, let's think about gender. Hey, let's think about sex. Let's think about race. Let's think about class. Let's think about disability, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're trying to now draw attention to, and I really think decolonize an institution that has been historically involved, and now I think is coming to a collective reckoning about its involvement in some pretty horrific things in the past. But, that's our generational task.
Wow, yes. Okay, I need to take notes on this. Because there's so many good things you mentioned here that I want to talk about. All right, sorry, give me a second. So I think the first thing that caught my ear, right, is that you mentioned that we're currently in kind of like a reckoning for a new era for universities, right?
Yeah.
So I think we can all kind of agree that COVID had a huge impact on that because of everyone's at home. They're like, oh, we can do this at home. Why do we need a university, right?
Yeah.
And what do you think? What are your thought process on that? Where do you think we're going into the future, and where do you think how would everything change? And do you think that is this still necessary, or is this still going to be replaced by something else?
Yeah. I mean, these are great questions. I mean, hashtag no pressure. But yeah, I think, my outlook right now is one that's kind of I think I have moved through a little bit of kind of accepting that we have a dark future ahead of us. But what I have found in the confrontation of that is actually a lot of hope.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, we have some demons to face.
Yeah.
And we can't keep running from them. And that we do need to face them, and they will be hard.
Yeah.
And I do think that means looking to folks who can help us figure out how to grieve. And because that's, I think, kind of what that is, right? You're having to face and contend with something that has been historically traumatic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, it kind of sucks. A bunch of us are here trying to figure out the aftermath and how to deal with it, and still fighting over a bunch of stuff that's related to it,
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's something here where I'm I'm kind of called to people who are doing grief work, and I have a deep appreciation for them.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like a certain avenue that I never thought at first I would be going down, but it's a kind of spiritual avenue.
Yeah.
Which is, I think this is a kind of, a bunch of us need to do some interior work.
Yeah.
And to do some sitting down, facing historical issues and the past.
Yeah.
And grieving.
Yeah.
And learning how to move through that.
Yeah.
And I do think in the process of that, there's a certain kind of cool rebirth.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the Caribbean's got a lot to say about that too, right? Because these are a bunch of people who I think who have historically been 500 plus years under intense forms of domination and control and expropriated labor, etc. And so, for me, this is where spiritual practices like voodoo and Santeria come in, but they come in I think not the dominant way that we've thought about them, which I think is kind of weirdly maligned, devil worshipping practices and
witchcraft
so forth,
and stuff.
Witchcraft, etc. Yeah. But actually, these are practices that are about grieving the dead, because these are communities who have been afflicted with so much death.
Yeah.
So they are cultures that have really worked on and have really amazing relationships to the dead and rituals to working with the dead. And I don't think we know how to read that a lot of times. And I do think it freaks a lot of people out.
I think part of it is because we didn't grow up with it, right? So it's hard for us to understand it fully. Another part maybe just like you said earlier, how we are embedded in language thinking, because we think in English. So maybe if they speak, I assume they speak Spanish over there in Caribbean, right?
A lot of it's Creole. It's a mixture.
Creole. Oh, yeah. So
it's
they must
a
have their
newly
own
born.
thing. Yeah, that's a mixture, and I think then based on that mixture, they're going to have a completely different definition for how things is viewed or how things is valued and stuff as well.
Totally.
Definitely. Yeah. Man, and I think one thing that caught my eye or caught my ear earlier, you said, is that you feel like looking to the future, right? There seems to be like a dark period that we're facing. But within it, there's hope. And what do you think? Like, what do you mean by like a dark period? Like all of the issue that we're addressing today, that we're seeing today, like such racism, and then also like the idea of like global warming and like the I guess like the what do you call it? Bipolarizing of the within the U.S. and stuff like that.
Totally.
Are those the things that you're like kind of like looking at?
I mean, I keep thinking like we're crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. Like it's wild to me how many crises we are currently juggling. And on a planetary scale. Like we're like our planet is almost dead. And we're still fighting over whether or not that's true. So we're having a knowledge war at the same time, which I do think is part of the death of the university. Because knowledge is breaking down. But we don't have a dominant institution to tell us what's truth anymore. And so, what's kind of great is, AI enters the room and is like, hey, let me change everything, right? Which I also think is part of the death of the university. But, there's, I think, going into thinking about the darkness, I think that's where I wanted to like come back to, is that I think we have all of these crises that are going on, but I don't think we know how to think about them. And I don't think we know how to kind of put them all together, because I do think they're all interrelated.
Definitely.
But we just don't know how to make the connections, which is really just an invitation to go figure it out, right? But we've got all of these wars raging around the globe, and it's not just the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? There's been tons of other, but they're not popping up, but they're there, right? And so we have all of these wars that are going on. We've had, the U.S. has been involved in wars abroad for a while now, right? Tons of folks trying to contend again with U.S. imperialism, but it's there, right? So we just, again, that's the demon to face. But, all of these have been causing so many crises and catastrophes, right? I think, again, of the financial collapse that just recently happened too, right? I mean, this is capitalism running amok, so, which is part of the imperial machinery. So, this is, we're at a point where we gotta rethink a lot now, because we are in deep, deep shit. And it's kind of scary. And I think we need, I don't know, there's something I think that we need that is not being met. But I do think the kind of where there's hope in kind of all of this darkness again is that I think in looking to the folks that are actually doing, the type of grief work and the community building work right now, because I think a lot of people too feel pretty isolated. Because of the pandemic and that crisis, right? But there's something kind of cool to the community building work, the emergence of mutual aid work and so forth, right? That's really supporting and helping sustain kind of what feels like the fall of the U.S. empire, or I don't know, but but these things are kind of like seeds in a desolate environment. And they're growing. And it's cool to tap into them and to find out where you can tap into it, right? And to figure out where you can kind of contribute. And I think that is it's not exactly lost on me that that's kind of spiritual thing, right? Yeah, it's like finding your purpose, But
kind of in essence, yeah.
Yeah. But it is like, there are these pockets of hopefulness that are really cool.
That sprinkle all over the place.
Yeah, legit.
That people are doing the work for. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think for me, right, like for our generation, for sure, is looking at it, there's definitely a lot of hopelessness that's like kind of like spread among us. Yeah. Like, well, we're all fucked someday.
Yeah.
I feel like, I think a good friend of mine actually told me about this, and I think this helped me a little bit, like just put it into perspective. There are a lot of things that's going well as well. Like, even though we have a lot of shit that's happening, that's like going down, right? That's going to shit. But I think us humans tend to just like focus on things that's going to shit because we want to fix the shit. But then I think in the meantime, we also sometimes lose sight of like the things that actually happened that was good, right? Yeah. I think global poverty, as bad as it is currently, has been improving a lot, actually, in the past few years, from what I know. And I think that, life quality in general around the globe has been improving a lot from where we are before. And then gender equality has been improving a lot significantly over the past 20 years-ish. So I think we have definitely done good work in the past.
Totally.
There are definitely more to be done.
Yeah.
And I definitely think there's hope there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking right now. I mean, I am affected. I'm like looking at the sweeping wave of anti-trans legislation coming.
Oh, yeah.
And it's daunting. I think, for a bunch of us, we're like, I don't identify as trans, but I do. This is part of my community, so I take that very seriously. And for a bunch of them, it is very scary.
Yeah,
and it's kind of what's happening in Florida feels like a cauldron of something very dark to come out of. So I think for a few of us, that's the kind of, I think we point to that darkness.
Yeah, definitely.
That we're like, what is brewing there?
Yeah.
So, but I do hear you. Yeah, I think I look at tons of friends and folks, like even on Instagram, and see the kind of really nice, healing, kind of cool things that they've been doing.
Yeah.
And I love the things that people are creating and making right now, which I think is kind of a lot of what I think will help
going forward into the future.
Moving forward, for sure.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was a good saga. Man, there's so many things I want to talk about. I don't want to take up too much of your time today.
No, you're fine. Keep going.
But yeah, I think we're going to take a short break over here and just like transition a little bit from talking about like history going forward into the future and stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about you, AM, like personally, right? So growing up, you mentioned you grew up on a small town, right? 183 people. That's really small. That's the smallest town I've ever heard personally in my life, right? What was it like? Was it like,
oh man,
like neighborhoodly? Is it very kind, or is it like very communal and stuff like that?
It was very communal. Mainly, it was my family.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it was. I grew up on one side of the road, and at first it was with my grandfather and my mom, and this is on a kind of it was part of an old plantation. And so my mother pulled tobacco, and so as a kid I would like run through tobacco fields and stuff.
Really? Wow.
And yeah, I was just talking with her the other day about this, and I was like, this is such a memory of mine of like running around with you. Yeah. And playing in tobacco barns and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, going into grad school, I started to make sense of that experience and be like, oh, yeah, this is plantation economy in Virginia, first colony of the U.S., you know? So, like, I could see where I fit, So, yeah, I grew up in that environment, and it is a close community. I grew up in a predominantly white community. It is pretty racist.
Yeah.
And my father was involved in Confederate like stuff and all of that. A large part of the males in my family are involved in that. I don't know really to this day, but we don't really, as I'm sure you've probably deduced at this point, we don't align on wanting to bring back the Confederacy. So that's the environment that I grew up in. And it was, I'm not going to lie, it was a little hard.
Yeah.
So, I had to get out, and I think my mom had to get out too.
Yeah.
And so we both got out in different ways. She went to California. I went to the coast.
I see.
Yeah. And so when I went to the coast, I actually went to live with my dad, who lived a little bit away. So I only got I got physically away from the rural parts.
Yeah.
Which there are many parts of rural life that I like really miss.
Yeah.
And
running in the fields.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And I was talking to students the other day in some of the Caribbean lit, they were talking about fireflies.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, this is a thing that's not in Seattle.
There are no fireflies, yeah.
Yeah, there are no fireflies, right? So, and the South really has that, and the humid night, and I really love it. But, so yeah, I grew up in that environment.
I see,
and then that's Virginia, and then after that, I kind of made my way out here to Seattle.
Definitely great, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah,
that's great. Fireflies, man. I've grown up personally in the city all my life.
Oh, okay.
I've never seen fireflies.
Whoa!
I've only seen them in movies.
Yeah.
They look like magical, absolutely magical.
It can be, and I think this is why I'm also I think I'm a little bit. I think this is maybe like part of my southernness that comes out, but there is a certain kind of like magical quality to the South that I do miss.
Yeah.
And I see it in certain forms of spirituality and stuff that I think I'm like inclined to a little bit.
Oh,
but
yeah?
I mean, the South has been like that for a very long time. You know, it has been like, it was the Bible Belt for a long time, right? So dominant religion was the thing. But I've always been attracted to the other variants of, spirituality in the South.
Such as? Is there like an example you can give us?
Yeah, voodoo is a big thing that runs through still, right?
Yeah.
Hence the connection to the Caribbean.
Yep.
But yeah, so, talk about that is like quite prevalent or, certain practices of Santeria and so forth. But that's all. I think it's also always bringing it back intellectually, but yeah, I mean, that is the environment that I grew up in. So, sometimes you're like, oh yeah, you don't run away from things.
Yeah,
it
comes back to you. It comes back to you for sure.
Yeah.
Dang, wow. Tobacco farm.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it changed when I saw the shift from an agricultural economy to a more industrial.
Oh.
So when that happened, it really changed things. And it moved from like a new factory opened up that was all about like producing, it was kind of like a precursor to IKEA.
Yeah.
Where they would like produce kind of like desk equipment and stuff like that.
I see.
Like the wood.
Yeah.
And so, my mom got a job there, but that destabilized gender in the area because women were now getting jobs in the factory.
Whoa.
And that was a little hard of a change for some people to work with.
I see.
So, so I think this also just brings to mind the way that I think my training has allowed me to think about it too, which has been like, I've always I'm looking at the economic shifts in the area too, and the way that the politics work there.
I see.
Because in many ways, I lived a bunch of it in the South, it feels.
That's crazy, yeah. So you had a lot of really up close firsthand experience with all of this idea that we're like kind of like that you're personally like looking through, right?
Yeah.
Because you saw the shift of like the shift in balance of gender equality and then like how people handle it. That's kind of like, I'm assuming that's kind of how people handle it in the North, like, I don't know, like in 1900s or something, like when the Industrial Revolution first started, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, not everybody took to it, right?
I mean, yeah. For sure. That is crazy, yeah. So like, if that were to be the case, right, what do you think makes you different in that sense? Because I'm assuming a lot of your community that you grew up with, right, must have like stayed the way their parents are, right? Yeah. But you're definitely very different from how your parents are, like just in beliefs and like even like education and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So what is it, do you think that is like, that separates you guys, or like that made you become who you are?
I think, this is I'm a big proponent. I was really attracted to queer studies in queer theory, right? To be like, what exactly is that? Because I feel like this is something that I've always been called.
Yeah.
As you said, you're different. It's different. So this is the queer. Yeah. And in the South, that word is very charged, the way that is used. And the first time I ever heard it, it was said to me.
Wow.
So it wasn't something that you kind of adopted, but it was like something that was labeled onto you. And you're kind of figuring out like, wait, what is it? At first you're like, what, why am I so different? What is going on? You know? But you start to learn a little bit more about that. I think as I got older, I read more queer theorists, and I read a bunch of other people who had very similar experiences and felt this way. And, they really helped.
Yeah.
They help you think about like how society is structured around creating norms and how there are people that willingly or not deviate from those norms, quote unquote, but they're only seen as deviations because the norm is invisibilized. The norm is hidden.
Yeah.
And so in many ways we expose the norm. And that can be really threatening for people if they don't, because they're starting to go through a process of denaturalizing something that they have taken for granted. And for some people, that can be very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right?
Dang. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me think about that for a second. Sit in with that.
So notice how like queer things are always the strange things, right? You're always like, what is that? And so queer theory, when I work with students a lot, I'll be like, when we think through a queer lens, which I think is very useful because it helps us, notice you watch a film or something and you look for a queer character. It doesn't have to be a white queer character, which I think a lot of people think sometimes now, right? But it's someone who's strange, someone who's kind of bizarre, like doesn't seem to fit in. That's like very odd, right? And you're like, what the hell is going on with that character? Right? That's where you go. Because that character helps you better understand the kind of social dynamics of what's happening with a group. Right? And then what is the norm that's not being said?
I see.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And just to clarify here, right? Because I know the word queer, right? My understanding, at least personally, is normally used to talk about like the LGBTQ community, right?
It can be.
But in this case, it's just anybody who is just different from the norm.
It can be, quite distinct, right?
Okay, I see.
Because once you go back in time, too, right? I mean, the word queer has been used historically very differently across time and space. But, when we're going back in time, queer kind of just means like oblique or off, something that's not normal. Yeah. So, yes, of course, it can. I think it aligns very well onto sexuality, and many people in that case, like I do use it in that way too.
Okay.
So it has the kind of the two meanings together.
Yeah, the combination of it. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. You need someone who is different to see what is normal.
I mean, they really help you.
Yeah.
They can help you think about power too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, about like how what you enjoy, kind of like privilege almost as a way as well, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dang, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Huh. Oh, that's a new thought I haven't thought about.
No, that's good. I'm here for new thoughts.
Definitely, yeah. Something different. It's kind of like putting a white dot on a black paper.
Yes.
And then you see, oh, this is a black paper now.
Right? And it can also play with your perception, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So it makes you think like, wait, is the blackness everything? Or, is the kind of whiteness everything, but the blackness is like maybe something that you're too close up to.
Yeah.
Right? So it can play... Queerness can make you change perspective in really wild ways at times. Yeah. Right?
But it's all about the perspective and the thing that you're looking at.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that thought. Yeah,
for sure.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And it's great when you do historical work. Like watch old movies.
Yeah.
Right? Because even it's always interesting too what characters stand out to you to be queer or off or strange, right? Yeah. Yeah. And they won't always align with being like a gay character or a lesbian character, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes their sexuality is just completely amorphous. You don't even know, right? So, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
For sure. Wow. Huh. I don't know why I just thought about this because I was on the link station the other day.
Yeah.
I was like thinking about it to myself. I was like, I had my AirPods in. I was like, how strange would I be if I were to transplant 100 years ago and you see a guy that has wearing AirPods just talking to himself. You just think that's a guy just wearing white beans in his ears and talking.
Yes.
He's mad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the perspective change.
100%.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
And it shows you, it's like superimposing you into a different environment all of a sudden makes you're imbued with something, right? Like you have the appearance of difference. Like what is going on here, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Dang. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Okay. All right, and we're going to make a quick transition here to a little bit more about your daily routine. Yeah.
Oh, my daily routine.
Do you have a daily routine? Is there one you do?
I have been really working on my routine lately. So, yes, I've been hardcore working on my routine lately. Yeah.
Let's see. So what do you do? What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? Like, when do you wake up? And what do you do?
If it's like, I've been trying to do this thing where I'm like, okay, I'm going to do the like working hours. I'm kind of a morning person, so... If it's a working week, I'm trying to get up at 6.
Okay.
And then I go and do my little meditation practice, which has been like really lovely to just kind of ground and center. Like, what am I doing today? Right? I can get a little bit, you may have noticed in the conversation, but the way that I think too is very, some folks describe it as kind of like watery or intuitive thinking. Yeah, it's a flowy type thinking. And so, and in water, right, so much is very interconnected. Yep. So in my daily life, that's kind of how I can operate, where I'm like doing all kinds of stuff. And then I'm like, wait, where's the like...
Where am I at?
Yeah. So I need the kind of grounding and the centering to be like, what am I doing today? I can't do all the things, but let's do the set few. So I do that. And then, I've been paying attention to what I'm eating and working on trying to like just eat really well and take care of myself. And, I'm doing all the self-care things, you know? So... Yeah, I do my morning stuff. Usually listen to the news. I'm like all up on kind of trying to figure out what the hell is going on in the world. Yep. And so I'm following a few kind of key things, and that's been very exciting.
Definitely,
I do enjoy that. So, and then... Yeah, then I'm usually kind of either writing or preparing for teaching. So I go through my like writing in the morning. I'll stop and do some lunch, and then I'll come back and do a little bit of writing. And then I've been doing more yoga. So
yoga.
Which has been very nice.
Yoga is fun.
So,
moving meditation.
Yeah, it has been very, very nice. Yeah. I feel like the pandemic has given me a new appreciation for slowing down.
Definitely. Definitely. When everything you do is work and you just cannot stop thinking about work.
I know.
Like, it's time to stop.
Right?
Meditation and yoga. Yeah. That is the way to go. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of my routine during the day. And then in the evening, I leave myself like whatever I kind of want to do.
Yeah, okay.
So,
I see. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
I can be balanced. A workhorse sometimes. So sometimes I'm like, I'll just read a little bit more.
Just a bit more.
Yeah.
Get too passionate about it and you just get all your time sucked in.
I'm telling you.
I definitely understand.
It's like a lure sometimes.
Yeah. Kind of going back to the pandemic and stuff, working from home and stuff. Definitely. Yeah. I guess like you mentioned you read news, right? Have you? I don't know if you follow much about like the tech news, tech world news.
I love it. Yeah. I'm so into it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You may know a lot more than me, but
definitely as a bit of a CS nerd. But I think, have you heard about the ChatGPT 4 that was recently
100%.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. GPT-4 was recently released.
Yeah.
And then like, I think that is definitely going back to what we were talking about, revolutionizing education and stuff. That is, I think, is a big factor, right?
Totally.
Where do you see like kind of where ChatGPT 4 is going to go, or like where do you see the future of AI is going to go?
Woof.
And how does that relate to like the problems that we're talking about and stuff?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I wish I knew where it would go. I don't think I'm a prophet, but Yeah. Who knows? I have this kind of like, again, I'm a little titillated where I'm like, ooh, what is going to happen?
Yeah.
You know? I think it is pretty revolutionary, if not kind of a wrecking ball in the side of some education, right? But
Definitely.
I do think we just have to think smart about how to use it.
Yeah.
Like, so I don't want to necessarily be, I mean, I have long been on the train of like trying to make education much more green and much more tech oriented, and not at the compromise of education, because I do think education has a role to play in getting people to think critically, interdisciplinarily, and thinking smart about what's happening in the world.
Definitely, yeah.
So, I do think there's so much that tech can help us with. And so in my classes, I mean, I've used tons of for a while I was like trying to get students to use Twitter when it first came out.
Oh, really?
And
Wow.
like I remember there was the period where we did a lot of stuff. This was still when I was in undergrad, but I mean, everything was still paper based.
Yeah.
And so I remember really egging people on to be like, can we just switch some of this to digital? Like it should be fine, right?
Wow, forward thinker.
So for a while, I do think it is the like wave that we should know how to ride, and think smart about how to ride it. Because I think, now that we have access to robots now that are able to kind of very quickly scan all the information of the internet and condense it to provide you something. And even if they're not always true, for those of us who have been trained as researchers, we know how to think critically about what information and stuff where we kind of need to get and so forth, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So I think there are many ways in which a bunch of us can check the chatbot, right? Like, because sure, if you plug in something and like, I think most people are so worried about the essay stuff, and I'm like,
cheating
I
on
think
homeworks.
It's kind of a red herring where I'm like, I don't really think that's the point. Like, I think that's kind of too focused on something, but missing a much larger picture here. But like, there's a lot of power with this too,
definitely,
right? Of like, and I do think education is in a position to be able to help folks know how to navigate a sea of information.
Definitely, yeah.
Because you can drown, right? You have to know how to navigate. So we need a kind of like, I kind of think of like, we kind of need like a new cartography, like how, I don't know, the Atlantic Ocean was mapped when it was crossed, for the first time. They invented things to know how to do the crossing, right? And we can do similar things, I think, to help students know how to navigate a very big sea of information. Definitely. And I feel like I've been trying to do that in my own courses with students. But
just kind of implementing it through all the way. For sure, I think like, personally for me, I agree with everything you said, right, in a sense. And I think that this definitely happened before. It's not the first time we've seen something that revolutionized. Like, I think when Google, like when search first came out, it's like, well, hold up. Yeah, plagiarism. Like, we don't worry about that. And that was, I think, this is a new form of Google in some sense. It's like revolutionizing search engine and stuff. And how people like perform and like do search, and also like how they process information as well. I think definitely to your point, it's very important. I think this is why it makes, what I think personally makes education even more valuable, is that with all this information, how do you think critically about what you're being presented, and how can you be like, hey, how can you think for yourself and say like, how does this information benefit me, and like, how can I actually use it and stuff like that, right? Definitely, Well, let me check the time real fast to see how long we've been going for. Okay, that is exactly an hour. So I think, so now we're nearing our end here, AM.
Sure.
Today. Thank you so much again for coming on.
Yeah, of course.
I guess like just wrapping up, right? Since a lot of our listeners, I assume, is going to be students or like of other people who are like just here trying to learn things just like gaining new perspective from different professors and seeing what they're like, right? Is there any like final giveaway tip that you will give? Just like a big general life lesson that you think helped you a lot growing up, or like helped you a lot to help you get here? And Yeah.
Man, read some critical interdisciplinary people.
Okay.
They will always help you, you know? I mean, this is like, you know, Black feminist scholarship has always been extremely helpful to me.
Yeah.
You know, Black queer scholarship, too, has been extremely helpful. Working in the Caribbean, you know, I try to get my students to read, like, Afro-Caribbean texts and folks.
Yeah.
And that work just, it helps you understand the world.
I see. Okay. Got it.
So, yeah.
Gaining a better perspective.
Yeah.
Through looking through a different perspective.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to what we were talking about, like, talking about the queer topic, right? Like seeing that from other people's perspective to see whether you're zooming in too much on a Black
totally
stuff like
right.
that. Definitely, yeah. Well, thank you again, AM. It's been a pleasure talking with you in the past hour. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
There we go. All right. We're going to cut it here.